from an undisclosed location in the Great Western Desert in the land of the free and autonomous Native American people. The 2024 presidential campaign in its time to return all US land back to their right's owners. This is the Ben Zion Podcast. Techno-communism will win.
Welcome back to the Ben Zion Show. I'm going to do a short talk. Probably upload it right away. It's just something that was on my mind. Now, this maybe somebody who you think of as a little gloomy, doom and gloom about some of these things. And we are facing down the barrel of capitalism's climate apocalypse. That's not something to be especially excited about. But I was thinking about the incredible things that have happened in relatively recent decades. Imagining a person born right at the time that the Civil War ended, living, let's say, in New York City. And a young person was at that time not living in modernity, but very, in their young life, trains were built that allowed them to travel quite quickly across that city and across that country, even. And real-time conversations could suddenly be had because of the telephone. Those two types of developments catapulted modernity into the 20th century description of that, modern life. And just imagine how incredible it would be to live at that moment where you lived as expected a kind of more provincial life. I mean, I think of New York of that time, I think of the movie Gangs of New York, or something like that. It's not a rosy picture of. And Gangs of New York is probably pretty optimistic compared to what life was like at that time for most people. Martin Scorsese's movies are not particularly sensitive to the concerns of black and brown folks. So that's a fantasy, a wonderful utopia compared to a lot of people's lives. I think of how a person who shaped my thoughts, I guess, almost as much as anyone, a certain Herbert George Wells, or a person whose most popular body of work is often compared and certainly shaped people's thinking quite as much. Jules Verne, these people of that time, who didn't just perceive modernity on the horizon, but shaped it very much because of those technologies. I think those two and others allowed them to imagine a 20th century far more utopian than the one that you pieces of shit actually built in the 20th century. Because Herbert George Wells wasn't a bootlicking dog like the rest of you. So he was able to imagine and even inspire people a little bit, but the elitist institutions got the better of you all, and you stopped imagining those things, and you stopped even fighting a little bit for those things. Some of you do, of course. There's 400 million people in the United States. Some of them are tiny, tiny babies, but almost all the rest of them are fascist sympathizers. I was thinking of people sometimes talk of the brilliance of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's not a work designed to raise consciousness in the way that some of Herbert George Wells's books were written, but a more remarkable accomplishment. If you think of those three people as people, futurists sometimes talk about how smart Ray Kurzweil is, but anybody that had come along, aside from building some pretty impressive engineering and computer science feats, that's no small thing. But anybody who could have come along at the right moment would have eventually said more or less what he said. And I don't want to downplay his contribution to some of this, but almost all the people who do value that contribution are capitalists, people selling you trickle-down economics with some kind of sci-fi jazz thrown in. And I'm inclined to believe that which is the thrust of this talk, that humanity would have achieved the things that Ray Kurzweil talks about much sooner, much more easily, if more people had been a little more like Herbert George Wells, and a little bit less like your drunk Uncle Joe, the fascist sympathizer not really thinking about the world as it really is, or fighting for better things, or even having any willingness to take revolutionary action, any techno-revolutionary or even revolutionary potential at all. You people suck. Mary Shelley was, if you could see even a piece of what the world might look like, or help to shape a piece of what the world might look like, she would be another of those persons who used an imaginative work to shape the world. In the first 4 decades of the Industrial Revolution, basically, almost a century before some of H.G. Wells' better work, or a century before. If you could see that, that's very, there could have, somebody like Mary Shelley, in a world where Lenin's revolution had been allowed to happen, where there's not elitist institutions choking life out of the planet, and when there's not bootlicking dogs just sitting idly by while elitists choke the life out of the planet. That's the world. That's the Western world. That's the civilization that most of you more or less uphold with your every word and deed, or at least don't challenge significantly. Somebody like Mary Shelley should have been the Frankenstein, the Ray Kurzweil of the 50s or 60s in that better world. And if you don't believe that the AI singularity could have happened sooner, I mean, come on. We're talking about every sector being changed transformed by socialism more than it was in the 20th century. That could have easily happened. And what made me think of this, aside from thinking about these folks, and this was all part of a conversation that I had with a watcher of the show. I don't want to always just be calling him out. We'll call him Hank. And Hank believes in the need for revolutionary action, but Hank also tends to, most of his views of history and the world around him, or an awful lot of them, are colored by what I would call imperialist propaganda. So almost, if you ask him, what do you think about China or North Korea, he'll say a bunch of stuff that could just be reading off the CIA talking points teleprompter. So he's one of these people who, well, I'm not going to believe your lies about socialism anymore. Well, what about the lies about the actual institutions that exist in the world? Oh, I'll believe those. But in the abstract, I'm not going to believe your lies about socialism anymore. But Hank is doing his best. You all need to try to understand the world better, and that's why, who can understand the world in its entirety? That's why we need things like artificial superintelligence and a large group of people being connected to one another. And I'm not going to do that show where I talk about what the path to this hive mind collectivism that I support is. So I was listening to a talk with Ben Goertzel, somebody I met a couple of times. In a slightly better world, we might be friends. We live in a pretty shitty world. But I like his thinking on certain things. He's not a person who acknowledges the need for revolutionary action. He's somebody probably more or less in that same point in the political compass as our friend Hank. But he has some other anti-establishment views that kind of counterbalance that, so that's why I'd say more or less in the same point, even though, but anyway, he talked at some length, and maybe I'll share the link in the comments here, on how, he's talked about this a few times, on how the AI sector itself, which is now acknowledged as something that's world transforming power, if it had been just funded a little bit differently at the time when he first started working on this, and funded in the way that he would have wanted it funded, he thinks that we would have already seen AI singularity 15 or 20 years ago. So that's one sector, and that's one phase of history. So if you can just apply that logic, if you can accept that that's true, if you can just apply that logic to the world revolution of Lenin occurring, spreading out throughout the world in the 30s and 40s, not being met by any elitist violence, led to collapse of socialist countries instead, but actual existing socialism, the best of it, becoming better and better, stronger and stronger. There should have been a Ray Kurzweil predicting the AI singularity, not in the 80s, early 90s, late 90s, but in the 50s or 60s. And it's this is all within your grasp. A world that is controlled by the workers of the world uniting. It's within your grasp in a way that it was not quite within the grasp of the people who first theorized this, because you can build superintelligence. You have the technology, whereas they could not. They would have had to unite humanity to common purpose. But uniting a billion people, uniting a million people to common purpose, uniting a dozen people to common purpose, really has